As you meditate, give permission to your bodily vehicle to relax. To be at peace. Let the body abide in serenity, alert, aware, awake, but free of stress. Free of any muscle contractions or knots. Free of any points of inhibition or fear, and allow the organism to feel free, to enjoy the flow of its life energy. And as the body relaxes and the heart rate slows down, and you feel grounded and present and safe and secure, you can feel the breathing slowing down and the thoughts also becoming slower and deeper. And the thoughts in words and images are fewer and more far between. And you can notice that pure awareness emerges between the thoughts, behind the thoughts. Pure, complete presence
without any need or desire to think, but to fully enjoy the gift of presence. And allow the consciousness to feel, to perceive in some subtle way the light, the inner light of pure divine consciousness. Saturate the mind and the body and the space of the aura and the phenomenal field surrounding the body. And let the attention be absorbed in the light whose source is not of this phenomenal world, but from that beyond that is within. And beyond all duality of within or without. But the light is filled with love. And you are both the receiver of the light and the source and the transmitter. And as the receiver of the light, in the acceptance of that luminous gift of grace, you can know the feeling of complete, total, profound acceptance of yourself, your being, your life, your nature. Your essence. As you resonate with this highest frequency of supreme, benign, healing presence, you can feel the relief and the joy of surrender. And the joy of feeling in resonance with the source of your being. And as you focus on the vibrational quality of the presence of supreme beingness, of the Absolute that contains and pervades and transcends all that is, you can feel the infinitely soothing power of melting into this eternal, infinite, loving power. Intelligence and love. Allow this presence to dissolve all tendencies of a lower kind from the past, all tendencies of judgment, all attacking affects, all projections, all fear and all desire. So that you return to your original innocence, your original knowledge of your formless nature, bodiless, non-local, infinite wholeness. And know that everything that has happened has brought you to this point where you can realize the truth and the beauty of God and allow yourself to accept the salvation of union. Through the simple shedding of all the identifications and self-images of the past that were never true to who you are. And as you shed all of those judgmental thoughts and all the conditionings and all the limited beliefs, feel how this freedom and liberation from illusion enables you to connect again with a creative imagination, intelligence, beauty. And love of life, and love of that eternal life which you manifest with a love that is unconditional. There is no past, no future is here. Even the present is an illusion, because you are timeless, and the self in its timelessness realizes its perfect incorporeal nature. Of loveful presence, that spontaneously experiences the flow of chronological time as a content of that timeless presence that never changes. And the self's appearances in time are recognized simply as those coherent tokens of the development of consciousness into its absolute blossoming into the fullness of supreme presence. And now allow the paradox of this infinite, joyous nature of bodiless awareness to merge seamlessly with eternity expressing itself as time and space and beauty and truth. As God's masterful work of art. Of which you are a manifestation of archetypal beauty, goodness, and power. And now gradually come back into the bodily awareness of phenomenal space and time, in peace and joy, grounded, awake, alert, aware, illumined, and free. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Namaste. Thank you, Hanuman, for that beautiful music. Thank you all who are here in the Mahatma Lodge, and all the Mahatmas who may be listening in their own lodges, wherever they may be in the phenomenal plane, but in resonance and connection that transcends physical space or time. And so we are gathered for another satsang, which is a word that could also be called a satya sang, a gathering to be in the refuge of truth. Truth that expresses Sat, the ultimate power of the real, of being that transcends all illusion, all limited thought forms, all limited paradigms and frames of reference, and allows consciousness to be downloaded in its complete, utter, unlimited nature, which is our birthright, as manifestations of that power of creation that is infinite consciousness, infinite goodness, love, and constantly, forever offering blessings of awakening, of grace, of freedom from suffering, and offering that path of truth that releases us from all suffering and enables us to abide in that supreme ocean of bliss that is the destination and the origin of every one of us. And so this is a sacred space that we are creating together. And those who are here have specifically gathered for that purpose. And sacredness means unity. Unity with the highest, with that ultimate, supreme, absolute presence of goodness and truth and beauty that is beyond limitation of form or thought. But the source and the potentiality of all creativity, both natural and supernatural, both personal and collective, pragmatic and archetypal, and that gives us access to that psychotechnology that alone can liberate all beings from whatever knots of karma, of maya, of self-torment in which they may feel trapped or stuck. And just having the faith that this knowledge has the power to free you, to dispel all obstacles to your fulfillment, can open that portal of awareness within you that gives you the permission and the power to release whatever root thoughts of suffering may still plague the heart in any way, so that life can be lived in joy that is unbounded and filled with the purity of our essential nature as manifestations of that wholeness, that absolute presence that cannot be divided or fragmented, and that has never been touched by imperfection or pain or suffering or illusion, and to which we are destined and invited to return and to establish ourselves in that resonant frequency that is our true home. And so a satsang is a sacred space of refuge and oasis in which we can come and feel permission to know that freedom of pure love, that in some other space we might be too overwhelmed to give ourselves the joy of surrendering to. And this space enables us to let go of all of those lower and partial identifications that have kept us in conditioned patterns of behavior, of thought, of feeling that have repeated those traumatic traces in memory, whether repressed or conscious, that have had to plague us in life until we could come to understand the secret of mastery. And it's that secret of mastery over the mind which is granted through unconditional surrender to the infinite intelligence and power of being who is also merciful, forgiving, accepting, and who exchanges suffering for wisdom. And in the offer of that exchange and the receiving of the wisdom that makes the mind coherent, completely coherent with itself, with its world, with its every layer of the spectrum of consciousness, with its absolute infinite fractal nature on the phenomenal plane and its infinite noumenal unity as the observer and the awareness who knows. This offer of amnesty through the receiving of grace that comes from the surrender of the ego and all of its mistaken beliefs and misshapen self-images enable the emergence of that unfabricated beauty that transcends all power of pretense or of construction or of attempts at improvement or attempts at amelioration or denial or defensiveness of any kind. but enables the complete opening of the heart so that the radiance of our being as healing manifestations of the Source grants us that joy of giving that changes the trajectory of our destiny and brings us into intimate and immediate feeling of the union of consciousness with that presence that makes us both disappear and realize what it means to be real. So the floor is open. If anyone here or anyone listening anywhere wishes to ask a question or make a comment or share an experience or an imperience or contribute in some way to the exchange of illusion for truth and light and love, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Shunya. Our first question comes from Carolyn. She says that she's having difficulty because her 43-year-old son puts her down during family get-togethers. And she asked him to leave last time and had to insist because she has a home of peace and it must be respected. And she asks, how should I react to that type of situation?
First of all, one should not react. One needs to approach every situation with the freedom to respond without reactivity. And so there must be understanding that when anyone offers negative comments, they are asking for help. They're begging for help. They want to receive forgiveness and the understanding that they feel that they deserve your offering of forgiveness to them. And so it means that you have been given information that there is not a true meeting of the hearts, and that this is of urgent importance to the one who has made such a comment or an energetic invasion of a peaceful space with disharmonious behavior. And if it is treated with not only compassion, but with the interest in understanding its root, one can draw forth the poison out of that being and accept it without pain, but as an offering of taking away the pain of the other and helping to turn it into wisdom through a reconciliation that sees the goodness and the beauty and the perfection of the one who has been forced to act in that way in order to make it clear that they do not feel that they have been seen in that way sufficiently to create a self-image that would enable them to act in a divine manner. And so if one can replace whatever negative projections might be there either at the moment or from the past through a willingness to look more deeply into the soul and the heart from the sense of one's godly nature of love and of forgiveness and of peace, then that exchange of energy will transform the poison into the nectar of divine love, and an entirely new relationship can emerge and blossom using the fertilizer of that pain and allowing it to blossom as joy. In order to do that, one must be free of having any kind of a guilty conscience that would have been triggered into a defensive reactivity that would need to defend one's own self-image, one's honor, one's position at the expense of love. The luxury of love depends on one's having been purified in one's own heart of any negative sense of sinfulness or unworthiness or inadequacy or lack or having failed the other in some way. And through that purification, through the inner work that one must have done in order to be able to face such a situation with clarity and with the overabundance of love that is not deterred from being offered, no matter how it might be received, will overwhelm the defenses of the other and enable the two hearts both to melt together and perhaps to cry together, so that all of the walls of the past can finally dissolve and love can be victorious. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Oliver. Oliver says, warm greetings to all of you from the UK. He asks, once ego death has happened, is one still subject to desires? And if bodily or mental desires arise, what strategies can one use effectively to deal with them?
If ego death has truly happened, then desire will have been transformed into love. It will have been purified of lust and of greed and of anger and of the duality of love-hate and of the infatuations of projection and the unconscious, perhaps, agendas of affirmation and support from the other and filling any sense of lack and all of those tricks that the ego plays in its desire to be desired. But if the desire emerges as a benevolent offering of the gift of love for the upliftment of all beings or particular beings or of nature or of the energy field in its harmonious capacity to support life and joy among all others, if that love is unlimited in its nature and without any of those elements of, let's say, denied neediness that the ego will try to emplace so that it doesn't create hooks of attachment and of capture by the jouissance, the enjoyment of what that love brings back in its relational flow, then the love as a download and an offering from the source for its benevolent purpose, if that love can be offered without needing anything in return, and if the situation can be left without any thoughts of wanting it to repeat or return or to remain as objects of mental support or cushioning of one's relationship to life, then they will emerge both as the fulfillment and completion of what might have been left in the prarabdha karma of a being who has gone through ego death, but whose ego before that time of death had certain, let's say, obligatory karmic loose ends that needed to be tied up. And if they can be done with that energy of love in its purity, then they will appear as temporary phenomena that will not disturb the consciousness or destabilize it from its focus in the absolute, and will not cause it to lose the fullness of light and presence and inner silence and stillness and grace of its true nature. But if one sees that there has been any loss of that, any capture by a phenomenal bodily identity as a result, then one can know that there are still traces of egoic identification that have not yet been dissolved, and it will become a learning that the journey is not yet complete. And the more pure that the consciousness becomes of ego, because the nature of ego is to create masks and illusory censoring of aspects of reality, the purer the consciousness becomes, the more that the real in its totality, in its fullness, will appear, will be apperceived in its total richness, such that every moment will be filled with the delight and the astonishment and the wonderment and the sublime joy of presence that does not need to be punctuated by particular experiences and is not affected either positively or negatively by whatever events seem to arise in the flow. And the flow is always contained within the stillness. And so long as that unification of the two is undisturbed, then there will be no doubt about the question of ego death. It won't even arise as a question, because there must be some trace of ego left to wonder if ego death has been achieved. And without that, the mind in its silence remains simply as it is, without questions. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, it is. And we have a message from Carolyn from the first question. She thanks you for your answer.
Speak a little louder, please.
Our next question comes from Doug. And he says, Shunyamurti provides me with a vast and deep reservoir of knowledge. How to move from knowledge accumulation to spiritual realization?
This is a very important question. the modern and postmodern ego structure has shifted its basis from the more classical ego in earlier times, which was based on faith. And because in this secular society, science has replaced, for most people at least, religion as the rock of ages, if you will. There are still, of course, people who have a very strong faith in God that has not been dented by materialism or Darwinism or the various paradigms of Newtonian science, mechanistic thinking, and all of that. But for the most part, we have been indoctrinated into a sufficiently fragmented, because science in its current form fragments us, into a certain basis of dependence upon science. And in science, the way to get to a new level of mastery, whether it's in technology or in the art of applying understandings and insights to the practice of life, one requires first the knowledge that creates a paradigm shift. Because if one is living in a paradigm that one has not recognized, will not allow one's establishment in egoless presence. Because there are assumptions that consciousness is the body or identified with ego thought patterns and conditionings, and that life demands loyalty to certain abstract beliefs. And in the scientific mind frame, there has been a shift, an upward downness, an upside downness of consciousness, in which the abstract thoughts of science have become concretized in the mind. And the most concrete and direct realizations have become abstract, such that in order to reach that which we already are, we have to first put the understanding of that which we are, which is very direct, into a completely abstract form of a symbolic nature that can supersede and integrate the incoherence of the fragmented views of science and perhaps religion and certain fragments of self-identifications and of various other paradigms that we may have picked up along the way, and be able to enable them to point to that direct realization that is so concrete it's prior to thought. Because thought is an abstraction. But the ego lives in thought, so that now presence has become an abstraction because we have made ourselves abstract. We have abstracted our own essence from being into thinking. And we have come to live in a representational field rather than a field of true presence. And so if one is in that situation and captured by the mind's conditioned thought patterns within a paradigm that does not allow one to leave and abide in silence, because there are commands of a superego that say you must produce thought, you must be creative, you must be in control, you must always be ahead of the other person, and you must always be able to map out what's happening in a very abstract, sequential planning mode of activity with all kinds of options and backdoors, and all of this multitasking that the ego takes for granted as inherent to the need to protect its territoriality. Once one one realizes that there are forces, vertices of a command system implicit in the ego's frame of reference, that unless they are cut through understanding, will not give one access to the silence that is one's own birthright, and enable one to be free of the pressures and tendencies to pull oneself back into activity and agitation and mental movement and stirring the waters of one's internal environment because of fear of boredom or of dissolving in too much peace or being overwhelmed by too much love or any of the other fears that the ego has. So I hope I made it clear that I think because of the nature of the current ego structure, we must use thought in order to cut our dependence on thought. And that thought is a part of the wholeness. Understanding is a part of enlightenment and liberation. Liberation doesn't make you stupid, it makes you more intelligent. And if you're more intelligent, you will be able to use thought and understanding in order to help other people gain freedom. So you don't want to abandon the use of thought, but you want to titrate it and use it as the benevolent instrument that it is meant to be, rather than to be plagued by thoughts that keep coming into your mind that you can't stop or change, because you are yourself identified with thought as an artifact that has been produced as a self-image that must react to the thoughts of the other. So I hope that makes it clear, and that this is why jnana yoga, the yoga of understanding, can be an indispensable tool to help people who are stuck with obsessive thinking to use the sword of truth with the power of thought to free them from the dominance of thought over presence. I know that's pretty long-winded and used a lot of thoughts, but I hope that they helped one to get to the root of how you use thought, because you have to use thought as a pointer and as a capacity to cut obsolete false thoughts. But you can't know they're false unless you have the power of discernment, which is clear thought, sattvic thought, that can say, well, this thought and this belief about myself or about my behavior or about how things should be is obsolete, incoherent, and conventional and belonging to a frame of reference that I no longer have to submit to. Okay.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Yasmin. It's two questions, actually. The first one is, what are the different states before and after liberation? And the second one is, how to overcome an overwhelming experience or state?
I'm having to be the answer man tonight. A very odd position to be in, because really, you know, a satsang should be a dialogue, and I'm sure everyone here already knows all these answers anyway. Because we're in resonance with the answers, because our nature is to be always already liberated. You see, so the first answer to your question is there are no stages before liberation, because you are never not liberated, and there are no stages after liberation, because liberation is liberation from the illusion of time, and therefore of any sense of afterness. So the question itself disappears in the achievement of liberation, but that achievement is simply an acceptance of what you already know that you have been censoring. Okay? So it's nothing that you have to get, it's just that you have to stop hiding from the truth of your liberated nature. And when you stop hiding from it, you will also become aware of why you chose to hide from it, and all of those, let's say, choices of concealment of the self and defense of one's heart, perhaps from toxic environments and false kinds of love, and the need to withdraw from aversive conditions or take other types of actions that would have concealed from oneself thoughts that were not safe to think or to express. And these usually are from early childhood or leftover tendencies from another lifetime of some kind of conflicts, political or social or interpersonal, that required the creation of tendencies of repression and of fragmentation and dissociation. But the underlying wholeness of our being has never been lost or disturbed. And the underlying wholeness of being contains the awareness of space and time as structures that are created by thought itself in order to morph the presence of eternity into the illusion of time. Okay? That's the purpose of thought. And it does that so that we can analyze eternity by splitting it into its momentary appearances that can reveal essential aspects of the whole that will not otherwise be able to be isolated. In the same way that science will do that with chemicals or with atoms or subatomic particles, there's always that attempt to isolate a certain essence, a certain chemical, a certain element, in order to then determine what are its potentialities. But the potentiality of our being emerges fully not from the isolation, which did produce and does produce certain capacities of focus, which is why science has developed a lot of technological capacity to produce all kinds of gadgets that depend on laws of nature that may be relatively true within certain limited frames of reference and scopes of activity, but maybe not in some larger sense or paradigm. But the capacity then to bring what is incoherent in science, which is occurs because of the loss of wholeness in the gain of the analytic capacity to understand the parts and the fragments, we have lost the power that comes from the wisdom that grasps and groks the whole instantaneously and can spontaneously move from that center of absolute presence and absolute power that transcends anything that scientific technology can grant us. So the stages that you can talk about are really the amounts of freedom to mature into levels of consciousness that transcend the infantile ego and all the sedimentary levels that we put on top of it since birth, or since even the intrauterine emergence of a proto-ego, to the present, and dissolve all the apparent boundaries between these sedimentary levels and allow a unifying, luminous, resonant, standing wave to make the entirety of life coherent, and a life that transcends the biological and biographical existence of the organism or the mind's knowledge of acquired information patterns, so that we can re-access our capacity for awareness of the whole instantaneously at every moment and be able to download and articulate and express and transmit whatever power is needed for the sake of the benefit of the evolutionary manifestation of that wholeness as an aspect and a quality of the collective unconscious and the field of phenomenal divine reflection of our being. So what might look like stages of an individual's growth are actually manifestations of the macrocosmic transformation that is perceived by an apparent individual. And the liberation from the apparent individual as the source of perception is that final letting go that allows the God self to fully manifest as the unity of subject and object. And after that, there are no stages. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. And the second question was how to overcome an overwhelming experience or state.
Why would you want to overcome it? You want to enjoy it. Especially if it's overwhelming bliss. We shouldn't be afraid of overwhelming bliss. The ego is terrified of bliss because that means ego death. But if there are other kinds of overwhelming, let's say, nasty affects, then what we need to achieve is overwhelming strength and the power of mastery over the mind. And that can only be gained through a surrender of the ego to the overwhelming power of God. And in that surrender, we will not fear being overwhelmed because we know we are protected and guarded by that power, and that it will be used to dissolve any demonic presences in our field or negative thought forms. And that's what healing is really about. Is allowing one to be overwhelmed so by the luminous presence of the God self, so that no dis-ease can remain in one's mental or physical field. Does anyone here want to ask? Yeah, Hanuman.
I had a morning recently where I felt there was more discernment between everything that my mind and the thoughts are trying to say and capture my attention with, and a new sense of what God is. Like, it wasn't anything from the past or any idea. Actually, it was more just like an openness. Mm-hmm. And I really, I felt like I wanted to stay there. I wanted to just continue to be able to see such a clear distinction between where my mind normally goes. Mm-hmm. And I think partly it's that in action, in doing things during the day, tasks and activities and planning and all these types of activities bring the mind into a different kind of place where I'm relating back into being somebody, being a person, relating to others, relating to the world. And it feels like if I was able to stay in that place where I could see clearly the difference, then I wouldn't lose that sense of openness, and mm-hmm. I would be able to function in a way that was much more accurate and the way that I feel like I yearn to act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there's nothing that stops you except the belief that you can't do it. Mm-hmm. And karma yoga means the practice of not holding on to such a belief, so that the body and mind can work while the awareness remains present, changeless, timeless, and without any effort. and without any identification with the doer of the action on the physical plane. The body seems to be the doer, but there's actually a spontaneous energy that is guiding it, that is the will of that Supreme Presence. And as long as you don't get in its way, you will be attuned and in resonance with it, and what the body does will not affect you. In fact, it will even help remind you to stay present during activities, because the more mindful you are, the better they will go, and the better the results and the outcome. But you won't care. You won't be focusing either on outcome or on how am I doing kind of thoughts to get approval. But there will be that simple peace and love that comes of serving and of knowing that all of your actions are helping the community and the world to thrive, and that you are building the kingdom of heaven through those actions. And if those kinds of thoughts can be there, then they will soon turn into simply the flow of divine presence without thought. And the day will be blissful, and it won't even seem like any time went by at all, because time, the illusion of time, will dissolve. Right now you're feeling it, right? You're not off-center, right? Your body was active, you were speaking, you were interacting, but there was no reason or need for you to come down into some lower level of consciousness, nor is there ever. But that's a practice. And once you can establish yourself in that, the Taoists call it Wu Wei, then that will be second nature, and there will be that kind of a recognition of the truth of your relationship to the body, in which you realize you are not the body and it's simply an instrument of God's service. That will happen the moment the body wakes up from sleep, and it will last the whole day without interruption. Okay. And that's why karma yoga is such an essential practice, and why living in a community in which all of one's karma is meant to be a yoga enables one to do the kinds of work, physical or mental work, without identification, attachment, competition, territoriality, all of the ways that egoic life causes you to use your work to gain prestige and to gain secondary goals of the ego, rather than to simply be a server who doesn't need anything in return from their action, because it's a gift of love to the world. Mm-hmm.
First of all, Yasmin thanks you very much for your answer to her question. Mm. And we have a question from Danilo from Brazil. Mm. He says, "Hello, Shunya. Thank you for offering the Satsang today. I would like to get clarification on what is happening in a more macro context to the planet, energy-wise. What is the new earth that people often talk about in spiritual circles? And what is happening to the physical body during this process of ascension?"
Hello, Danilo. Every civilization, just like every individual life, has a trajectory. It has a birth, it has a time of flourishing, and then it has a time of gradual decline and senility. And a time when its merit has been exhausted, and it turns to corrupt means to extend its lifespan. And the more corrupt its means become, the more disaffected become the members of those societies. And as the corrupt ruling elite lose their legitimacy, they need to divert the attention of those who are not happy with the situation onto other demonized enemies, so that they will not be disturbed in their own rule and enjoyment of the profits that become ever more ill-gotten and undeserved. And as the system loses its legitimacy and its ethical basis, the number of schisms and fragmentations and movements of secession and movements of revolution and movements of cynicism and despair, and the amount of suicides go way up, the amounts of drug use, the amounts of antidepressives and anti-anxiety, anti-this and that, and efforts to use substances to try to find some higher truth than is offered by the educational system or life. And the recognition that all of the leaders, the people who we depend on for wisdom in order to navigate our way through a very dangerous situation, all of them are incoherent and are unable to work together harmoniously to solve problems, but instead create more conflicts. And rather than resolving issues, create worse ones, and then try to blame others for those problems so that they can continue to offer pseudo-salvation from a clear demise that will soon be reflected in the consciousness of Gaia, who will not put up with this. And so we see cataclysmic earth changes that are also happening in response to the corruption of human consciousness, the failure to steward nature, the failure to care and love for all beings, and let alone human beings, the stratification of society that mandates unbearable suffering for the masses, the disinformation, the lies that sustain wars and manipulations of economies, etc. All of these things are common knowledge to people, but they are part of a terminal illness of a society that has, for the first time in our historical thrust, become globalized. And so we are at a planetary precipice. And yes, a new earth is being formed, or at least a new consciousness that Gaia will be able to be in resonance with and use to clean up and purify the environment of all of the pollution, the radiation, the chemicals and biological warfare elements, and all the weaponization of culture that has gone on, and the results of that, which have become a pall of death over the world, and the destruction of the oceans and the rainforests. Someone in Brazil would know that very well, and the destruction of the living environment that can support human and other life forms. As we see, we're in the midst of a massive die-off and extinction. So we know that what is happening is of a level of consequence far beyond anything that can any longer be controlled through social or political means, or through any ordinary attempts to ameliorate the situation, whether through lowering greenhouse gases and other kinds of environmental efforts. We understand the futility of all of that. But what has not been admitted is this very point, which is that the demise of the living environment is a reflection of the demise of consciousness to a level of destructiveness and corruption and impurity that can no longer support or sustain life. And so we have a terminally ill global civilization and life itself in that way. And the death that is underway must precede the rebirth. And many people would like to avoid the death and just go to rebirth and end the suffering, but let things continue with the present population numbers and just try to use technology of a scientific kind to solve the problem. But it's technology and that very approach that has caused the problem, and no problem can be solved at the level at which it was brought into being. So it requires an upliftment, an ascension, as Danilo said, of consciousness to that highest level of intelligence that we would call God consciousness. Intelligence, benevolence, love, generosity, and freedom from the fear of death, or even the belief that death is a reality, such that a more coherent, in fact, a completely coherent energy field can be downloaded from that supreme source and transmitted to all the brains of human beings around the world, each of which is a node of consciousness that retransmits that same modulated waveform of God's intelligence and can share it with everyone else in their local space. And when there's a sufficiently powerful grid of consciousnesses that are unified with the one consciousness from which all derive and remain parts of, then what had been a field of conflict and autonomous or pseudo-autonomous egos competing with one another can become a field of superorganismic unity, such that the power of consciousness itself shifts from being, let's say, an ordinary light bulb to being a laser beam of infinite power to be able to break through the current form of manifestation of the appearance of our planetary field of quantum wave function, let's say, stagnancy and decomposition, and shift that waveform by decollapsing it from its present form and allowing a complete new appearance of the stuff of consciousness that actually makes up the cosmos, which is not made of matter, it's not made of actually separated entities and species of animals and plants and all of that. It's made of a single capacity of consciousness to manifest itself in infinite forms of beauty. But when we get back to that original source and we allow that to manifest as an overwhelming, to use that word again, coherence that wipes out the incoherence of ego minds in conflict and hatred and demonic activity, then that death and the rebirth will simultaneously cross, and in that intersection, all suffering will end and all traces of the ruins of a destroyed world will be replaced by the rebirth of a world and of nature in its most pristine and beautiful divine form that come from that archetypal level of the creative imagination, which is an element of God consciousness, far beyond what the human level of consciousness could enable to manifest. But in our surrender to that level, then the new earth, if you want to use that term, the new world, the new cycle of time itself can emerge without any traces of the destruction that will have occurred and dissipated because the past doesn't exist, and the world can be in a state of absolute harmony and joy without any collective memory of the apocalyptic inferno that we will have to have passed through in order to achieve this restoration of our true nature in planetary form. So the question of what happens to us will depend on, for each of us, on how much surrender and how high our consciousness has decided to go in its complete saturation with that power and presence of God, so that there is no identification with matter, and the material body itself can be transmuted into light and be able to pass through this time of transformation with a continuity of presence that does not need to enter into suspended animation of those who have not disidentified from a body form, who will feel destroyed and annihilated. But once the ego has been annihilated and the identifications have been annihilated, but presence remains in its timeless, eternal form, there will be a passage through without the loss of that power of presence that will enable the manifestation of that consciousness in union with God to embody itself as an avatar whose function will be to protect the incorruptibility of the world order and the system of nature and of cosmic harmony that transcends even the jurisdiction of the planet. Hope that's helpful. People are asking very difficult and complex questions, so I apologize for such long answers, but to really give them accurately, I think we have to go into the nuances. So please, I hope I'm not taking too much of your time and trying to develop a full context to answer these questions in a way that I feel they deserve. Any local inhabitants? Yes, Satyadas.
Yeah, thank you. In previous teachings, you said that a time will come when we won't have, let's say, like the luxury to meditate so much or be so much like in satsangs like this. And that always feels a bit like, oh no, like. And so the question is like, why is that the case? Is as if as Kali Yuga collapses, shouldn't yogis actually increase their sadhanas of meditation and satsangs and all that?
No. They should go beyond the need for any formal kind of meditation. Once you are in God consciousness, there is no one left to meditate. Because who meditates? It's an ego that still feels a lack, that feels, oh, I need more. I need more God consciousness, more silence, more presence, more purification, right? But when you've achieved it, then there's no more need for that. You are that. You know, Ramana never meditated after he got to Arunachala. That need died along with the ego. So there are even many texts in the Vedic tradition that say it's a shame if you're still meditating. A yogi should be ashamed of needing to meditate. If you're not past that already, then you're still in the elementary phase of development. So we won't need to meet or give instruction about that or do guided visualizations or any of those things, because we'll already be there. But the reason why we won't be able to have these meetings is we're going to be flooded by refugees from the collapsing Kali Yuga who are going to need us to meditate with them and to help them heal and calm their anxieties and answer the questions of the same kind that I'm having to answer tonight. You'll all be answering for lots of visitors and people who who need to be calmed and centered and healed and return to their true nature because they don't know what's going on and they're terrified. And they need to know that they can depend on the protection of God to get them through this period. But that protection will not protect the ego, it protects the real self. And so we must be in the real in order to be able to do that. And when you are resonating in the real, there will be no fear, no desire, no mental chatter, no tendencies that will bring one down to a lower vibrational frequency, and nothing that can create disturbance. And when you're in that state, then you will be a walking satsang, and or a sitting satsang, or a planting, harvesting satsang, or a cooking. But whatever the body is doing, there will just be the transmission of divine energy into the space. And there won't be any need to gather and try to plug into the source, because we will already have been fully charged. Okay. Oh, we're nearly at the end of our official time for tonight's satsang. Are there any burning questions from cyber world?
No, that concludes
All right.
it.
Well, I want everyone to know I appreciate the questions. They were very profound and important questions, very useful, and I hope the answers were also and beneficial for everyone. But I think that this kind of interchange is a valuable way for all of us to be on the same page and the same resonant frequency, and then together even raise that resonant frequency until we can establish ourselves in that absolute state beyond questions or doubt or thought. And at that point, there won't be any questions anyway, and the satsang will simply be a blissful sharing of the luminous presence of the One Self. But as we get to the points where we are no longer in need of theoretical understanding, because that's been internalized already, I think everyone who participates in these is going to find that in their own lives, they will begin to magnetically draw other people who will be asking them such questions or wanting support or consultation or healing, because the understanding, the resonance, the practice of being in the state that the understanding points to enables a kind of power to flow through the body-mind that will become apparent to others and will draw their desire to understand and to receive and to transform that may have been latent in them prior to meeting someone in that state. So everyone who is participating is part of the one mind, the one Buddha nature, the one Tao, the one God consciousness. And we should never consider ourselves to be different from that. So I hope everyone remains in that resonance of, with, and as the one supreme intelligence who manifests as this multiplicity, and never feel separated from that. Namaste. Thank you all. We'll meet again for another one soon. Have people here enjoyed it? Yeah, good. Okay. As we turn off the